Somewhere in a data center running a frontier model right now, a developer typed 4 letters that locked their entire pipeline to one company's hardware. Those 4 letters were not a chip specification or a hardware order. They were a software dependency, and the moment they landed in the codebase, every subsequent library, every optimization pass, every hiring decision that followed was priced against them. That dependency is called CUDA, it belongs to Nvidia, and it sits underneath the largest installed base in accelerated computing. Huawei's compute architecture for neural networks has spent years positioning itself as the framework that pries that lock open. 2 ecosystems, 1 developer population, and an odds call that has nothing to do with transistor counts. The evidence to weigh, tooling depth on one side, convergence pace on the other, and the single metric that moves the line most, which is where model builders actually write their first line of accelerated code. The wager on each side is distinct. The first bet is that CUDA holds, not because Nvidia's chips are uncatchable, but because the software moat is. A decade of libraries covering linear algebra, mixed precision training, distributed communication, and inference optimization does not clone on demand. A developer starting a new project today inherits that entire stack at near zero marginal cost. The prior odds on that bet are a heavy favorite. The bulk of production workloads, the majority of open source model code, and most cloud provider acceleration paths run on CUDA. Tooling depth compounds. Each new library written against CUDA raises the floor a challenger must clear, and the floor has been rising for years. The second bet is that Huawei's compute architecture for neural networks, alongside a cluster of domestic frameworks targeting Ascend hardware, converges fast enough to become a genuine second rail. The mechanism driving that convergence is not competitive pitch or marketing, it is export restriction. The prior odds on that bet are significant underdog, but the line has moved. Reports from Chinese research institutions suggest the framework's compatibility layer for common model architectures has broadened materially over recent development cycles. The group's own claims, not yet independently benchmarked at scale, put porting friction for standard transformer workloads within a range that would have been implausible a few years earlier. The first place to price this is the moat argument itself. CUDA's library breadth represents roughly a decade of accumulated engineering, and no challenger has matched it. A developer who has built a training pipeline against that stack has not just chosen a hardware vendor. They have chosen a forum community, a set of operator optimizations they know by name, a debugging workflow they can execute without documentation, and a plug-in library assembled over years of production use. A musician who learned to record on one digital audio workstation does not switch platforms when a rival offers marginally better reverb. The sessions, the muscle memory, the institutional knowledge, all of it lives on the first platform. The new platform has to be categorically better, or the musician has to be starting from scratch. Developer lock into CUDA works the same way. The cost is not in the license fee, it is in everything the developer already knows how to do. The rebuttal to that argument is that breadth is not the same as necessity. Most production workloads touch a narrow subset of that library surface, and if a compatibility layer covers the critical path, the operations that dominate actual training and inference compute, the tail of rarely used functions matters less than the full moat framing suggests. PyTorch's own architecture introduced hardware-agnostic dispatch layers specifically because the maintainers anticipated multi-backend futures. That abstraction does not handbet be a win, but it is evidence that the CUDA assumption is not structurally permanent even inside the dominant framework. The odds move marginally toward the second bet. The moat is real but not sealed, and the line on CUDA holding tightens from commanding favorite to merely clear favorite. The export control argument is where the line moves in a direction that deserves more than a marginal notation. The standard framing says that restrictions on high-end Nvidia hardware to China deepened CUDA's position everywhere else, because every hyperscaler outside China that cannot source restricted chips defaults harder to the stack, whose alternative never had to be seriously evaluated. That framing is correct about the short run. It prices the wrong variable about the long run. The structurally captive Chinese developer base, numbering in the hundreds of thousands by most industry estimates, though no authoritative census exists, is being forced to acquire fluency in a competing framework at a pace that no voluntary migration ever achieves. A city that replaces its road network does not wait for drivers to voluntarily prefer the new layout. Everyone who needs to move through the city learns the new map because the old one no longer exists. Export controls work similarly on a developer base. The old map is not available, so the new map gets learned at scale and with urgency that no product roadmap could manufacture. Reports from Chinese university programs and state-affiliated research labs suggest that training in the domestic framework is appearing in curricula where CUDA once dominated by default. The institutional data is not independently audited, but the directional signal is consistent. Compulsory onboarding is a different mechanism than optional adoption, and it scales differently. The odds move toward the second bet on the long-run developer base argument. The domestic stack does not need to win globally to become a second rail. It needs only to hold its captive base and export tooling competence outward. There's one dimension where the second bet loses, and the loss should be priced flat. On third-party open-weight model portability and out-of-the-box operator coverage for the current generation of major architectures, the domestic framework trails CUDA by a margin that even its own documentation does not dispute. Porting a major open-weight model to Ascend hardware today requires non-trivial operator-level engineering work that a CUDA deployment simply does not. This is not a rounding error in the comparison. It is a real productivity cost measured in developer hours that any developer with a genuine choice will price before committing to a stack. The evidence here comes not from vendor claims, but from open source contribution logs and practitioner forum accounts, and the consensus across those sources is that meaningful operator gaps remain as of the most recent public reporting. The rebuttal is true and should be heard. Compatibility layers are active engineering targets, not static conditions, and the gap has been narrowing. But narrowing is not closed, and the timeline to closure is genuinely uncertain. The odds move back toward the first bet on this specific metric. Portability is the single clearest near-term advantage CUDA holds at the workload level, and no other evidence in this weighing recovers that loss for the challenger. The constraint became catalyst dynamic is most legible when examining toolchain investment pace. Huawei's public roadmap for the domestic framework and parallel efforts from domestic framework maintainers accelerated integration timelines that predate the most recent restriction rounds, suggesting the response was anticipated rather than improvised. Anticipated investment is not the same as delivered capability, and that distinction matters precisely here. Roadmaps are plans. The question is what has shipped, been tested under production load, and been reproduced by teams without an institutional mandate to use it. No independent third-party benchmark comparable to the ML-PERF methodology has publicly evaluated the domestic framework at scale under controlled conditions as of the most recent available reporting. That absence does not disprove the capability claims. Benchmarks routinely lag demonstrated performance, and the absence of a public result is not a negative result. But it does mean the odds call for the second bet rests on vendor-adjacent evidence and institutional adoption signals, both of which carry a discount relative to empirical results from neutral parties. The odds move marginally back toward the first bet on evidentiary quality. The strongest evidence for CUDA holding is empirical and current. The strongest evidence for the domestic framework converging is structural and directional. That asymmetry is the honest summary of where the evidence stands. The decisive weighing turns on a structural fact rather than a benchmark result or a chip specification. China's model building cohort is now large enough and growing fast enough that a software stack capturing it exclusively would constitute a second rail capable of sustaining its own library ecosystem. A software platform does not require global dominance to become self-reinforcing. It requires a critical mass of active developers writing production code against it, accumulating the forms, the operator optimizations, the debugging workflows, and the hiring pipelines that constitute a moat. Reports suggest that mass is approaching the relevant threshold, though no authoritative count exists, and the group's own figures have not been independently audited. If that threshold is crossed, and the export restriction dynamic makes crossing it more likely rather than less, the question shifts from whether the domestic framework is a real alternative to whether it is an alternative that expands beyond its captive base. That expansion is where the genuine uncertainty lives. 3 reasons the second bet still loses despite that structural argument. First, the portability gap established in the prior weighing is a real near-term ceiling on voluntary adoption. As long as porting friction remains material, international model builders will not migrate unless forced, and the expansion thesis requires either closing that gap or finding a developer cohort large enough to sustain a separate ecosystem without international participation. Second, no independent reproduction of the framework's performance claims under hyperscale production conditions has been publicly reported. Vendor-adjacent evidence and institutional adoption data are consistent with the convergence thesis, but do not confirm it. A single credible third-party result showing the domestic framework within competitive range of CUDA on a standard large model training run would move the line sharply. Its absence to date is the most significant empirical gap in the second bet's case. Third, convergence pace is the key variable and the hardest to price, honestly. The domestic stack is fragmented. Multiple competing frameworks target overlapping hardware, and they do not all interoperate cleanly. Fragmentation inside the second bet is a structural drag that CUDA does not face to the same degree. If convergence stalls or produces competing incompatible layers rather than a unified rail, the captive developer base fractures rather than consolidates, and the network effect that would make the second rail self-sustaining never materializes. The synthesis, the decisive weighing moves the line toward the second bet on the long-run structural argument, because compulsory adoption at scale is a mechanism CUDA has never had to defeat, but the hedge is genuine. No reproduction, a material portability gap, and fragmentation risk together mean the challenger is credible, not confirmed. Two concrete catalysts will move the line next, and they are worth pricing in advance. The first is a credible third-party benchmark run under an ML perf equivalent methodology by an institution without a stake in either outcome that evaluates the domestic framework on a current generation large model training run under controlled conditions. If the result lands within competitive range of CUDA, the line moves sharply toward the second bet, and the vendor-adjacent evidence discount disappears. If the gap is wider than the group's own claims suggest, or if the benchmark reveals operator coverage holes not in the public documentation, the line moves back toward the first bet by at least as much as the structural argument moved it forward. This is potentially the largest single line mover available, and its absence is itself the most significant ongoing discount on the second bet's credibility. The second catalyst is an internationally distributed open weight model, one originating outside China's institutional ecosystem that ships with native domestic framework support alongside CUDA. That signal cannot be explained by mandate. It would represent voluntary adoption by a neutral developer community that found the porting cost acceptable, and it would directly answer the clean concession made in the portability weighing. A moderate to significant move toward the second bet would follow, because voluntary adoption from a community with alternatives is a qualitatively different signal than compulsory adoption from a community without them. Two additional catalysts sharpen the forward pricing. Evidence of fragmentation deepening inside China's domestic stack, competing incompatible framework versions, institutional adoption of rival domestic layers that do not interoperate, or framework-level forks that resist consolidation would move the line back toward the first bet. Fragmentation is the bear case for the second bet, and the scenario in which compulsory adoption produces not a unified second rail, but a collection of isolated local ecosystems with no network effect. If that scenario materializes, the captive developer base does not compound. It fragments. Conversely, a major cloud provider outside China announcing native Ascend or domestic framework support as a first-class production offering, not a compatibility wrapper, but a supported path with engineering commitment behind it, would reprice the international expansion thesis from structural argument to demonstrated commercial demand. If that lands within the next few product cycles, the second rail moves from credible to evidenced. If it does not, the expansion thesis weakens materially regardless of what happens inside the captive base. The evidence as it stands prices CUDA as a clear, but not unassailable favorite. The first bet holds the empirical present, tooling depth, portability, production track record, and a benchmark history that the challenger has not yet entered. No result has closed those gaps. The second bet holds the structural future argument, a developer base that is compelled rather than persuaded to learn a new stack, acquiring fluency at a rate that voluntary migration has never historically matched, on a convergence timeline that export pressure is actively accelerating in a way that no competitive pitch could have manufactured. The honest pricing is that CUDA wins the next 2 to 3 years with high confidence, and the 5 to 10 year line is genuinely open, not because the domestic framework has proven itself, but because the mechanism forcing its adoption is unlike anything CUDA faced during its own formative period. The constraint is doing the work that the product roadmap alone could not. Where the developer types those first 4 letters, that is still the anchor. It has not moved yet. The question is whether it moves before the infrastructure built on top of it becomes too expensive to relocate. 2 bets, 1 developer population, and the line shifts next, not when a chip ships, but when a neutral team runs the benchmark that everyone is waiting for and nobody has published. Which bet would you back, and what single piece of evidence would it take to change your mind? Put the catalyst in the comments. If pricing the race rather than calling the winner is how you want to follow the story, subscribe, because the next catalyst lands before the next video does.